So we're at the 13th parak in Sefer Shoftim, an amazing parak where we start a new chapter in Jewish history, a really complicated chapter in Jewish history. For those who have never studied the period of Shimshon, you prepare to be quite shaken. So let's start. It is a very, very strange beginning. We now meet our new antagonist, the new enemy on the scene, and that is, at the beginning we're told, Vayiyosifu b'nei Yisrael asas hara b'nei Hashem, vayitneim Hashem b'yad Plishtim arba'im shana. The nation of Israel did not learn, they carry on doing bad, and they are sold now into the hands of the Philistines, who subjugate them for 40 years. So let's just take a step backwards. The Philistines are going to be our perennial enemy for the next 150 years plus. They're going to be a thorn in the sides of Israel for the coming years. Just to understand who they are, if you remember, when Moshe Rabbeinu tells the nation of Israel, when Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu that you're going to inherit the land of Canaan, he tells them about 7 nations that they will conquer in the land of Canaan. And if you go through that list, you will not find the Plishtim. And the reason for that is because they are not one of the 7 Canaanite nations. They are not Canaanites at all. In fact, if you look at the burial practices of the Philistines, the burial rites, and you look at the pottery of the Canaanites, of which there is much, because we can see where they lived. We have the annals of their history. If you look at their history, they actually are more analogous to Greeks, which is fascinating. Aegean nations. They come, in fact, these are seafaring people who come from the areas of Crete, near Greece. And it is really fascinating, is that we actually have records of these seafaring nations trying to make landfall in multiple areas in the coast of the eastern Mediterranean. We know that they tried to attack the areas in northern Lebanon. We know that they try to attack the areas of the Nile Delta. So much so that we have in the writings on the tomb of Ramses III, he describes the following. He describes the seafaring people that tried to attack, and he says, I settled them in strongholds, bound in my name. Numerous were their classes, hundreds of thousands strong. I taxed them all in clothing and grain from the storehouses and granaries each year. And in fact, on the tomb there is, of Ramses III, is in fact a picture of the Philistine people who he put into captivity. You will see one of the interesting things about them is their fancy feathered headdress, which is one of the defining descriptions of the Philistines. So, interesting enough, if you actually, on this relief you don't see it, but in the background are their wives and children, meaning this was not just a military expedition, this was a colonial expedition. They were coming with their ships of families to settle in the Nile Delta, to take over the coastal region. They did not succeed. Ramses III pushed them off. This is now in the 13 to 1200 BC, centuries BCE, and we now know that they did not succeed in the Nile Delta, so they did succeed in the areas of southern Canaan. And this nation settled in the area of what we call Gaza today, which is the area called Philistia. And they took the coastal plains and they colonized it. So in fact, they settled down and they established 5 city-states, which are the areas of Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza City, Ekron, and Gat, right? So we have, these are their main city holds. You can go there and still see the remains of these ancient cities, or the Philistine cities. And they became a fortified stronghold in the southern coastal plain of Israel. They are not germane to the country. They come from the outside. If you think about it from the perspective of the country, thinking about it from the east side to the west side, think about the fact that the Israelites come from the east over the mountains into central Israel, Judea and Samaria, and the Philistines come from the west, from the sea, and they settle along the coast. It is inevitable these two cultures are going to clash, and the clash is starting now in the 13th chapter in Sefer Shoftim, and it's going to be a continued problem. One of the reasons why it's a problem for Israel, there are many reasons, but one of them is that they were also experts at metal, which means they came with advanced technology from their origins, from Crete. They had more sophisticated tools in iron ore. They are faster to entering the Iron Age than the Israelites. The Israelites are still in Bronze too, in the Second Bronze Age, which means that they therefore have a military advantage. And one of their military advantages is their military platform, the Iron Chariots. The Iron Chariot is going to dominate the coastal plains. Israel will not be able to compete on the coastal plains where you're able to ride chariots. As they move up into the mountains, that's where Israel remains, Israel being impervious or protected by the mountains. So this is going to be the continued fight between the mountains, which is why areas, as an example, like Beit Shemesh, is sort of on the coastal meridian between the mountains, right? As you start getting up to the mountains, if anybody's ever been to Tel Azeka recently, so in our group in February, we were just sitting on Tel Azeka together, and it's amazing because you see on the one hand the coastal plain stretching out, the Philistines, and on the other side is the mountains of Judea, which is where the Israelites were, which is why, of course, the meeting place of David and Goliath is at Tel Azeka, right next to Ramat Beit Shemesh, right? Because that's the division between the coastal plain of the Philistines and the mountains of the Israelites. All of this is defined by geography and these two cultures both coming from the outside and settling in the land of Israel and fighting for sovereignty over this area. Of course, it's worthwhile noticing that today we have a group of Arabs who call themselves Palestinians, and there is no Palestinian nation. There were a group of Arabs who were there for a bunch of time. There were Arabs who came in for economic prosperity when Jews started coming as well from Syria and from Egypt. But the reason why the area was called Palestine was not because of anything to do with the Philistines per se as in a nation. It's that after finally the Jews kept on rebelling against the Romans, and after the Bar Kokhba rebellion in the years 130 to 135 Common Era, the Romans were so fed up with Jews rebelling that they renamed the area Serena Palestina, as taking the name of this perennial enemy to sort of speak as a slap in the face of the Jews, so we wouldn't be fighting for our own land. They changed the name of Jerusalem too. They called it Elena Capitolana. Elena is the second name of Hadrian, right? So that's why they called it. They changed the name of Jerusalem as well. Happens to be so for that time, whether it was under whatever, whether it was the Romans, the Byzantines, the Ottomans, whoever it was, the Mamelukes, whoever it was called Palestine because that was the province of that other empire that controlled it. Happens to be that today there's a movement to try to fortify Palestinian indigenous movement by associating them with the Philistines. No connection whatsoever. The Philistines have been dead for a very, very long time. All you can find of them is pottery in Gat. That's about it. But nonetheless, that you will see such a movement. But it is, to me, obviously dramatically ironic that in the same area that the Philistines lived is where Gaza, our most problematic area, is today. Which is precisely where it was. In fact, the Philistines were a little further, took a little more area, but nonetheless, it's sort of history laughing at us as well. It's worthwhile noting as well that that in their original iteration, we're told that in fact that the birth of the Philistines already in Parshas Nach, and we hear about them. They are it describes as hapasruchim es hakasluchim asher yatzu misham plishtim. So the way it describes the Philistines is Yatzu Misham, that they arrived from them, and the Medrash Rabbah points out in the Neribi Abba that it was that the Pasruchim and Kasruchim Mamidim Hult Lison, which is bachelors. Hayu Elu Meganvin Shosein Shel Elu ve'Elu Meganvin Shosein Shel Elu. So there was this large intermarriage and called immoral, boundary breaking between these two nations of the Kasluchim and the Pasruchim. And as a function of that, out came the Philistines. Mayotzamehem Plishtim, Giborim. So they're a crossbreeding of two nations who had no moral boundaries. Okay? So meaning strength and immorality are the two defining factors, which should be helpful because those might actually be the two defining characteristics of our future leader. Is immorality and power, right? Which is parallel to their birth as well. It's also worthwhile noting that the Hebrew word palash, pei lamed shin, today means invader. So of course it also just means it's helpful to know that is they're defined. They're an outsider coming in. They're not indigenous. They claim indigeneity, but they're not. They're not. Now that's our antagonist. Let's start with our protagonist. Who's our protagonist in this case? So we hear Vayish echad mimitzara mimishpachat Dani u'shmo Manoach. So we hear a man from the tribe of Dan. His name is Manoach. Manoach means rest, and his wife does not give birth. And this angel appears to her. And he says to her, listen, you're not able to have children, but you are going to have children, but there's a few things you need to know. Al tishti yaim v'sheichar, do not drink any strong drinks. Al toichli kol tamei, do not consume anything impure. Ki Nach hara v'yarad ben, you're going to have a child. Umoreh lo yale al rasho, you're not going to put the razor to his hair. Ki nazir elakim nar min abeta, and he's going to be a Nazirite from birth, from utero. Hu yachel lo shias Israel mi plishtim, and he'll be the one to start saving the nation of Israel from the Philistines. She comes back to her husband. She tells Manoach that this man came to me. I didn't ask him where he came from. I don't know what he was, and he told me all these things. He told me I can't drink wine, I can't drink beer, and I'm not allowed to consume anything impure. So this is the sort of this first apparition. We've shifted from the national scale to the personal scale. We're in a personal drama over here. Really, really fascinating. First thing to notice is the tribe is born into is the tribe of Dan. It should not be lost upon us that in Parshas Vayetze, if you remember, Rachel remains akara. She remains unable to have children, and for years and years and years, she remains akara. While her sister gives birth to child after child after child, she turns to her husband and she says, "Give me children. I'm going to die." Yaakov Avinu is angry at this, and he says, "Am I in the place of God?" What does Rachel do in response to this? She says, "You know what? Maybe we'll create a surrogate motherhood." Right? So in those days, they didn't have the technology to do it in somebody else's womb, but they did use their maidservants, right? This was a surrogate motherhood. And she says, you maybe use my maidservant, Bilhah, and you'll have children. What is the outcome of that? A child called Dan. So Dan is the first child, the surrogate child of Rachel, essentially, right? He's the child of a mother who couldn't have children, desperately wanted children, who needed a child, right? Isn't this fascinating? Because then the parallel should be obvious to us, is here we have a mother who so desperately wants a child, who's not able to have a child. She has a child. This Shimshon, in a certain sense, is a microcosm or a rebound of that same Dan, the same arrival of Dan himself. Of course, that doesn't explain why specifically Dan, but if you look at the map, it does explain that, because if you take a look at the map of the division of the tribes, you'll see that the Philistines take in the whole coastal plain in the south area, where you see there's Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gat, and Ekron. Those are the 5 Philistine strongholds. Just to the north of them, who's the main tribe there, is Dan. Right? So Dan has the coastal region just above. In the area today where we would probably have Tel Aviv is where Dan is. Okay? So Yafo, right, that whole area is Dan, the Danite territory. So he is the natural neighbor, which, by the way, gives us a little bit of a sense of, if you remember the Gemara in Sukkah, which says that there was no tribe. Remember the whole discussion about when the sunlight was coming into the Sukkah and he's trying to change the subject. Rabbi Eliezer doesn't want to talk about the halacha in that case. So there was no tribe in Israel that didn't establish a shofet. That's what the Gemara says. And Rashi tries to figure out who are the shoftim to each tribe. But in a certain sense, the shofet is usually local to the problem. Right? Meaning, who's the shofet? The shofet is usually the person responding to the problem that's next door to them, which means, if you want to take a step back from a we'll call it a hashkacha perspective, the hashkacha has it that each tribe will have an agitator. That's the way to think about it. Meaning, Hashem will orchestrate that each tribe is going to have a bad neighbor, which will then cultivate a necessary leader. That's the way to understand this perspective. So this is Dan's chance to show his strength by having such an edge. Just to, usually we think of it responsively, but if you think about it from the perspective of the Hashkacha Elyana, the higher perspective, this is what's going on. Let's go a few things over here. Why does the angel appear to Mrs. Manoach, not to Mr. Manoach? Why is he the recipient? So already the Mefarshim point out that Barren says that she was a much more worthy woman than him. In fact, the Gemara says he was an Ama Aretz, he was an ignoramus. And then we're going to see this throughout the parak. He's not very adept at reading the tea leaves. Here we go. One second, so he's not able to to figure out things. We'll see a number of times he doesn't seem to be that with it. There is more to this in a moment, and we're going to come back to her in a moment. Yeah, but clearly as well, it is worthwhile noting that the Mefarshim point out that when the angel speaks to her, it says, "You are barren," which means in those days there was no fertility clinics to figure out what's going on, and you can imagine the pain in a marriage in those days, and they didn't know where the problem lay. Right? They had no idea. So there was obviously a lot of blame in this marriage. And the angel actually comes and tells her, by the way, it is you, but you're going to have a child. But maybe the reason why the angel chose her was because he wanted to convey to her, just biologically, the problem's on your side, but it's going to be resolved. But that was something that's a very sensitive thing to convey, and he says it to her. But nonetheless, she receives this message, and now he tells her this mandate: you're going to have a nazir. Now, just go back to the Parsha of Nazir, in Parshas Naso, it describes this. The Nazir is seen as something that a person chooses, right? This is where a person who wants that extra, we'll call it, level of separation, that self-elected priesthood for themselves is going to make their lives better. They're going to be more ascetic. They're going to be less involved in this worldly things and recess themselves for a minimum of 30 days. That's how it usually works. A default Nazirus is 30 days. A man or a woman, can a woman become a Nazira? The answer is yes, because the pasuk says ish or isha. Most people, it's like, in fact, one of the questions to get into smicha, Rav Shoftim used to always ask that is, can a woman become a nazira? And the answer is yes. The pasuk says so. You don't have to do guesswork. So, but nonetheless, a man or a woman who decide they want to become a nazir or nazira, they make three limitations in life. One is contact with the dead. The other one is wine. And the other one is hair cutting. Those are the three things that are the requirements of the Nazir. It seems like all three are mentioned here, but slightly differently, just to be aware of it. First of all, this is not elective, right? She is not asking to do this, right? She's not asking to do this. Number two is that it's without election. The child's becoming this as he's born, and also there's no limitation. This is Nazir Olam. This is a lifetime of Nazirus, which is strange. So you ask yourself, why is that? Why is that? Why should that be? The Ralbag has a very interesting observation. Gersonides, he says in source 10, the reason is because Shimshon is going to be extremely challenged on a moral level. We're going to see that he is going to have a lot of moral challenges. And prophylactically, God was saying, I'm going to give you a lot of, we'll call guide rails, to avoid some of the moral pitfalls you will encounter in your career. That's what's really essentially going on here. So I'm trying to protect you from yourself because I know what's going to happen. By the way, it doesn't work so well, right? Because we're going to see that Shimshon is going to have a very complex life, right? We're not going to want any of our children to act like Shimshon does. As we will see, right? So Shimshon is going to be morally compromised. This might be the prophylactic trying to save him from himself, as the Ralbag understands. But others say that maybe it's related to his strength, which is in his hair. It's just hard to understand that. We'll have to figure that out when we get later on to how his hair and his strength relate to each other, because the cutting of his hair at the hands of Delilah is going to be complicated. Like, what does that mean? David HaMelech was very strong and he had short hair, right? So the two are not necessarily connected to each other. So how does that work is going to be a real question. But there is something we need to examine, is this Nazirus is also going to be strange. Because you'll remember that Nazirus, one of the three things is that the person cannot come into contact with dead people. Now, in case you've read about anything about the history of Shimshon, he made many people dead. So he came into direct contact with lots of dead people. So hundreds of them. So if that's the case, it's not your regular Nazirus. We have to figure that out. Okay, so we're just going to put it as a question as we go forward: is what kind of Nazir is he? Like, what is God's plan in this situation? Very complicated as well. Similarly, he's told that he's going to save. He's going to save the people, start to save the people of Israel. Why start to save the people from the Philistines? Like, why not just save? Why is it Yachel Lashir et Israel? So there's a few reasons. One is there weren't any Philistines to fight with beforehand. So this is the first time a Shofet is starting. But it is also, if you remember that Israel has a bilateral contract with the Philistines, which just makes things complicated. If you remember in Parashas Vayera, Avram Avinu has a contract he makes with Avimelech. Avimelech is the default name of kings of Philistines, like Pharaoh to Egypt, Avimelech to Philistines. And Avimelech at that point in time, living in the area of Gerar, right, this is the earlier Philistines, made a contract in Tishkali Lini Ulninechti, that there's an intergenerational binding contract that they're not going to wage war with each other. So much so that the Rashbam, Rabbeinu Shmuel, on the Chumash, makes the shocking observation that the Akedah, which is the immediately following next chapter, chapter 22 in Bereshis, is as a function of Avram Avinu making that contract. It's a punishment, meaning you think you can protect your children by making a contract which you don't need without asking me. Well, let me see if you have your child, right? That's the way that the Rashbam reads the Akedah. Shocking, right? But the point is that there is this intergenerational binding contract between the two nations. So Yachel Ashes Israel, that the Chazal say, is that contract is reaching its statute of limitation now. So up till now, we haven't been able to really touch them. Shimshon will be the first one to wade into the post-peace accord attack of Israel. That's the Yachel, the beginning over here. And of course, as Dina is intuiting, the Yachel, of course, here means he won't finish the job. Right, meaning he's not going to be successful. You only start, not finish. Dina, yeah.
Also, it's the first time after we heard the pattern that is in Sefer Shoftim is the Israel are being
persecuted.
They're supposed to do, and then Vayizakul Hashem. It's the first time.
Exactly, very good. So Dina's pointing out a really good point, is that the nation of Israel not calling out to God, and I'll make it another. Let me dig that deeper in. Is we have many, many situations of couples in Nach, leaders in our nation, not having children. But in every single one of them, except for this case, the mother's praying to God. She's not praying to God either. Do you notice that? There's no prayer here. Right, which is shocking. You say to yourself, and that's paralleling the national silence in this person. This is 40 years of persecution, there's silence. And there's all these years of childlessness and silence. It's speaking to perhaps where the people are. We have to examine that a little further as we get into why her, which is a really, really fascinating question. Now, I love the game Broken Telephone, if you ever had played this. It's sort of like when you tell a message to one person, they tell it to another person, inevitably the message gets garbled by the end, right? Somebody misunderstands something by the end of the day, right? So it's really fascinating because it speaks to the idea of miscommunication, of how people misinterpret messages. Now, how do you know if a person really got something? Is you ask them, do you ask them to repeat after you what you just said to them, right? So what's interesting is she does not say everything she's told to her husband, right? So let's recap for a second. She's told 4 things. She's told that she may not drink wine, she may not consume anything impure, she cannot cut the hair of the child, and this child will start saving Israel. When she comes back to her husband and says, I met this strange dark stranger in the field, and he told me I'm going to have a child. And what does she say? I may not consume impure things, I may not drink wine. She left out the other 2. Isn't that fascinating? She didn't talk about saving Israel. She didn't talk about the haircut. And the haircut is a big thing, right? I mean, think about all the saved money from the barber, right? What's going on? Why is she omitting those details? I heard a really incredible insight from Nili Samet, who made a really interesting observation. She says, listen to this. Is she, in her sense, has to justify why she was the one who encountered this angel, as opposed to him. It's very embarrassing, right? He views himself as the man of the house, right? Right? All the wives should be nodding right now. It's like, there's a little bit of ego involved in husbands, right? And they think they're in charge of everything, right? And you have to explain to him why he, in this time, was not the man of the house, right? She was the one who received the prophecy. So what does she do? She softens the blow. What does she do? She tells him the things that relate to her pregnancy, right? Which is, during pregnancy, I can't drink wine, and I cannot drink, and I cannot consume impure things, because that's my responsibility as the mother who bears this child. She leaves out the things that will deal with his lifetime, because otherwise that puts salt in the wound of the fact that he wasn't consulted, right? Because that he's also a parent, right? So she's trying to soften the blow, which now leads us to the next section. So what's the first thing Manoach says?
Why didn't she tell them that it was her problem with
No, you're right. So again, obviously, sensitive. It's very sensitive, right? They would have made it easier, right?
I heard something else. Like she didn't want to tell her husband that he's going to be the savior of Israel. That's to protect the child.
It could be.
The child doesn't have that.
Right. So he's not growing up with that expectation.
On his shoulders.
Right. She's protecting. She's saving that child. And I appreciate that. It doesn't explain the cutting the hair piece of it, but she's clearly withholding information. And because she withholds information, that explains Manoach's next question.
But even cutting the hair, because then he's going to be different from all the other children.
That's true.
It's just to protect.
Very interesting. So that's a very good thesis, right? So that's another possibility in this as well. So yes.
No contact with the dead.
Yeah, we're going to have to deal with that. That's all.
That would be the fifth thing then.
Exactly. So that's clearly omitted. She cannot. There seems to be a me'ain, a similar part of that. She cannot consume impure things, but that only is for pregnancy, right? Afterwards, he is going to come into contact with the dead. We have to see how that fits. He's got a unique mold of Nazirus in many ways. We'll come back to that when we spend more time with him, because we haven't yet met him yet. He doesn't exist yet at this point. But yes, we're going to spend a bunch of time on that. So now comes Manoach, and he receives this message, and he says to his wife, he starts praying. He turns to God and he says, Bi Adoni, Bi Hashem, Isha lekima sheshalachta yavono eleinu, yoreinu ma na'aseh na'ara yulad. Please, God, send back the messenger to tell us what we should do with this child, right? And so what happens is the Malach comes and appears to her when he's not there. Right, and so she runs back and tells her husband. He comes out with her, and he says, "Please tell us what to do." And the Manoach says to him, "Everything I told her, you should do." It's terrible. This is really terrible. You can imagine how this is going. So a few things. Why does he ask the angel to come back? I mean, that's a little bit of an audacious request. I mean, like the angel of God has given you like a basara, and you come and say, "I need to hear him again." So the Malbim says exactly this point, is that he's only been given instructions for pregnancy, and he knows this child is a miraculous child, but what do we do afterwards? The reason he doesn't know is because his wife hasn't told him. Which what the Malach is really saying is, I told your wife what to do when the child's born. Right? You figure it out between the two of you. But the point is that that's the missing piece the Malbim points out over here, which is happening. I do want to point out that there is another little piece over here. And it's worthwhile just understanding the psychology of this as well. You see, they don't have children for all these years. She comes back from the field and she says, I met a stranger, I don't know where he comes from and I don't know what his name is, but he told us we're going to have a child. From the husband's perspective, that's not a good thing. That's not a good sign. So you understand there's probably an element of jealousy, or there's an element of concern for what his wife has just said right now. And so, in that request, there's something he needs to rectify, which is why we're going to see he's going to be very pedantic about every detail now. He's trying to figure out what's going on because he really doesn't know. I do want to make the observation that this parallels the way that the Torah sets this entire system up, which is, when does the parasha of Nazir appear? It appears after the section of Sota. Sota is when there's a question about the fidelity within a marriage, right? And the Nazir is the direct outcome of that over here. It is fascinating to me that the Nazirus is also playing on the weaknesses in this marriage itself, right? We'll try to scan that open. Actually, it is a little bit later, but one of the in the Koren series, Rabbi Michael Hatton has his observation. He would say if we scale that might be what's happening to Israel as well, meaning, in a certain sense, the Isha Sota is Israel, right? Is the infidelity is the nation of Israel, and the Nazirus imposed is the response to Israel's infidelity in general. That is playing itself out in the micro drama we're seeing over here. There is complexity in this marriage, right? But there's complexity in the larger marriage as well, which is part of what makes this difficult. This is a difficult conversation. Okay, now a few things just to be aware of. Who was this messenger? So we assume that it seems to be an angel of God. Just remember that the more rationalist Mefarshim, like the Ralbag Gersonides, who is in the camp of the Rambam, has a problem with this, because the understanding is like this: a physical being like you and me, a human being, cannot interact with a purely spiritual being, according to the Rambam and the Ralbag. Many other Mephoshim have no problem with that. There's apparitions and so on. But they say that any interaction of a physical being must be through the modality of a dream, right? It cannot be while they're in a physical state of lucidity. That's all fine until you have two people in the dream. Make sense? Right? So you see, that's the problem we run into in this case, which is you can't have two people in the same dream. You can't, meaning, like, right, you can't inhabit the same dream in such a way. Because here we have her and him speaking to angel, right? Unless she's dreaming about him being in the dream, or he's dreaming about her being in the dream, we can't have both of them in the dream, right? Which leads the Ralbag to say, perforce, we're not dealing with an angel. We're dealing with a prophet of God. And the default prophet of God who appears and disappears in Shoftim is Pinchas. So he says this is a human agency. It is not a divine agency of sorts because of this quirk. Many of the Alam Mephoshim do not accept this. They're all right with there being an apparition to people, but just understand the sensitivities of trying to figure out what's going on over here. By the way, I did put in a number of the pictures. There's so much artwork on this picture. There's a Rembrandt. This is a shiur picture. We'll get to the details in just a moment. So now what happens is Manoach gets this news, and he doesn't seem to fully get the picture yet. Because what does he do? He turns to this malach and he says, he said, let's make a sacrifice to you. Just wait a little bit. I want to bring a kid goat to you. And the angel says to him, I'm not going to accept your food. If you want to bring a sacrifice, bring it to God, not me. He didn't realize that this is the angel of God or the agency of God. So Manoach says, what's your name? We want to honor you. Tell us what your name is. Why are you asking my name? Peli. My name is Peli. Right? Just similar kind of reverberations of the conversation of Yaakov and the angel, that dark night in Pashas Vayishlach, like this nameless person. So Manoach, nonetheless, not getting the picture fully, brings the Gediyas in, brings the meal offering, puts it on the rock in front of this apparition, in front of this being, and umafila asos. And what happens is that it's consumed in fire. Everything explodes in flame, and the angel disappears in that flame as well. And they're watching this entire episode. And after this, Manoach and his wife realizes that this is real business here, right? This is not a soothsayer. And they we're going to die. Like, we just experienced this. And his wife says, my dear, honey, if we were going to die, we would have died, right? But clearly we haven't died, so clearly this is meant to be this. Why would we be given this message if he wanted to be killed? And she calms him down. Yeah, Ilana.
If it says here it was an angel,
yeah.
His name is Pele, why would the Ralbag?
Yeah, the Ralbag still struggles with it. The Ralbag understands that because of his struggle with the idea of two people consulting an angel, he says that clearly the prophet did something miraculous, the consuming of the fire, and maybe his name. We'll get to his name in a second. But what the Peli is, what he's trying to say. But let's take a step back for just a moment. Is what was he actually thinking? Like, why is he offering food to this to this angel? So. At the beginning, the Malbim, who's not in the Ralbag's camp, knows this is Malach Hashem. He understands that he thinks this is a human agency. He thinks this is a human being. And by the way, coming back to the distrust he has in the stranger speaking to his wife, right? It makes sense, meaning he's trying to sort of figure out who he is, what's going on over here. So he says, I'm going to give you a sacrifice because usually the man of God gives you a message, you repay the man of God. So I'm going to repay the man of God by giving him a Gediyas, and that's going to help me understand. It's going to capture this, which is what he tries to do. And when he declines that sort of expresses the fact that this is no longer a human agency, the way the Malbim understands it. That's the conversation that's going on over here. What is the relevance of the name? So let's go to the name for a second. So generally speaking, the way the Radak explains this, and he says this is a truth throughout Tanach, in source 20 is, he thinks this is a prophet of sorts, or a great person. The name explains who you are, where you come from, what you're about. So first he tries to understand it by saying, maybe you're a human being, maybe I can give you something to eat. He says, no, I'm not eating. So, it's very, 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 very noble prophet. Maybe I can know your name so I can find out who you are about. Meaning, Nach's trying to figure this out. He hasn't grasped this concept, which is why, again, at the beginning of the parak, the Barren says, Mrs. Manoach has less questions, right? She accepts things. He is struggling to conceptualize, struggling to put this all together. So what does Peli actually mean? He says, don't ask my name, it's Peli, right? So Rashi says that, these are beautiful descriptions. He says, Peli, it's mechuseh tamid, v'mishtaneh. Meaning, it is not a name. Peli means mufla. It's hidden, right? It's hidden, which is perhaps is what the Targum Yonatan is saying is muforash. Muforash doesn't mean explained, but muforash is separate. It's right. It's separate to you. It's beyond your understanding. Don't understand me. You're trying to contain me in your logic. I am beyond the scope of your conceptualization, is what he says. What was that? You're right. We're going to get to his wife's lack of name. Right.
Beyond his logic too.
He had a small scrap. Yes. The Malbim quotes the Bamidbar Rabbi, and he says, "Why is this?" He says, "Gam kiven ki shem malach hu lefi shlichusai." The angel is based on his name. Hu nishlach berega ze la'asos pilaot. He is sent to do what's pilaot? Wonders. He's meant to do wonders. So I am the herald of a wonder. So my name is Pele. I am a wonder. Niflaot is what's being umafli la'asot, right? Which is very powerful. So that actually is describing his actions. On the one hand, it's separate from your understanding, but it is also a wonder as well. What is interesting to me is also a fascinating thing is if you go back to the Torah and you see how Nazirus is accepted, what is the phraseology in the Torah? It says, Ish Oisha Ki Yafli Lindor Neder Nazir. Yafli means articulate. It's the way of using words to construct systems that were self-imposed. That's the word used for a neder. Yafli la'asot. Which means what is his job here is to create a wonder, a pele, but also he is articulating a new construct, a non-real construct. It didn't exist until now on this child. In a sense, all of that's happening at once. On the one hand, it's beyond conception. On the other hand, it's a wonder. And on the third hand, it is the Nazirus, which is being articulated all in this one name as well. We now move into the birth of Shimshon. She does have a child. She calls his name Shimshon. And he grows up, and God blesses him. Vatachel ruach Hashem lefa'amo. The Spirit of God starts lefa'amo. We have to see what that word means. B'machadian bein Sarah and Eshtael. Between Sarah and Eshtael, this is in the coastal plain area. What does lefa'amo mean? So the Radak explains lefa'amo lechazkoi, to strengthen him. He grows up and he has extraordinary strength. That's what the Radak says. He's given unusual strength. As vatipoem ruchoi, his spirit is awoken. He is a strong man. The Gemara in Sota says, no, it's the resonating with the blessing of Yaakov Avinu. If you go back to the blessings of Yaakov Avinu, Parshas Vayechi on for Dan, which is our tribe, the Gemara says in the name of Rabbi Chama and Rechanina, it says, Yehi Dan nachash ale derech. Dan will be a viper on the road. Shimshon is going to be the example of that nachash ale derech, that bites the rider and the horse and the rider falls. That's going to be done, and it's going to be Shimshon. So this prophecy is now illuminating his life. That's what's being said. But the Ralbag says, he says the image is like a pa'amon. What is a pa'amon? A bell. And the funny thing about a bell is that it tolls, but there's silence between each toll. Which means as you're hearing the bell ringing, there's silence between each note. And that's what happens to Shimshon. There'll be moments he'll be on, and he'll be the greatest exemplar of God. And there'll be moments of silence, and you'll wonder, is this the man of God? Right? Which means to say he's not going to be we'll call it our even keel, straight line shofet that we've seen up till now. He's going to actually be a sine curve. right? He's going to be like a bell which is ringing the entire time. That's the way it really speaks to the complexity of this character. I'd like to conclude with one just fascinating observation, and that is as follows. You'll notice that both the Manoach and his wife have very different responses to this Besorah, right? And so she accepts it immediately without any question. She doesn't even ask, the Tanach emphasizes, she doesn't even ask where he comes from or what his name is. She says that. And he can't stop asking questions, right? He needs him to come back. He needs to understand what the child's doing. He needs to give him a gift. He needs to know his name, right? And then he misunderstands, right? There's a lot of questions which go to speak to this. And perhaps, it's interesting, it's perhaps her innocence and her purity of perspective, which allows her to be the recipient of this prophecy more than ultimately him. She proves herself to be worthy in her interactions of this as well. But I think there's something bigger which is going on in this parak, which is, as the Gemara describes, the Gemara says a very fascinating comment, which requires understanding the Gemara in Brachos. It says, Manoach ama aretz haya. He was an ignoramus. It describes when she's leading him back to the field, he walks after his wife, right? Now, by the way, you should know, the Gemara goes on to say, walking after one's wife, listening to his wife is a great thing, Chanan Elkanah, and the whole thing, that was a great thing, right? But in a certain sense, this entire parak is about this man following his wife, not just to the field, but like in a certain sense, who is the main character in our parak? Is Mrs. Manoach, and yet she has no name. The way I view this parak in a certain sense is that there is a certain element of silent satire over here, of leadership, which is the leadership over here does not need the name. She is the central figure. It should have been that he was nameless and she was the one with the name, because clearly she's leading the charge. She gets it already. She is humble about her acceptance, and she's able to calm her husband down. She is the leader. In a certain sense, this to me is biblical satire, where the Tanach is telling us that the leadership does not need titles. I wonder if leadership not needing titles might be the most appropriate precursor or introduction to Shimshon, because Shimshon is not going to be a representative leader of Israel. So much so that the people of Israel will reject him as their leader, and they will sell him to the Philistines themselves because he's too dangerous for them. Which means to say, does a leader need a title? And our parak speaks to the titleless leader, in this case the woman, Mrs. Manoach, which is, I think, ultimately the message which is being conveyed.